Hi everyone. So this week we should have had a couple lectures, but I have decided that I made two lectures into one. So today we're going to learn about modes of living, and these are the ways that people survive in the world. So the first thing we need to consider is the concept of ecology. And ecology is the relationship of an organism to other elements in its environmental sphere. Again, ecology is the relationship of an organism to other elements in its environmental sphere. So the map on the screen right now is a map of the ecological zones of the world. As you can tell, we kind of live in a cold climate. You probably knew that from the outside anyway. Human beings have adapted themselves to their ecological environments through culture, and we call this cultural ecology. And this is the way people use culture to adapt to their environment by choosing a specific type of clothing. They can sometimes change the way they eat, what they eat, things like that. All of this is cultural ecology. And in anthropology, these terms are used to explain the way humans survive in their environments. Now, production is the way in which humans take energy out of nature and use it for their own uses. There are basically 5 different modes of production or modes of livelihood or dominant ways of making a living that we generally discuss in anthropological contexts. And these different modes produce food through different methods. Along with these different modes of livelihood come different social characteristics like division of labor, land rights, and resource control. And all of these characteristics are part of the ecology of human life. Modes of livelihood are defined by their production characteristics. The 5 modes include foraging, horticulture, pastoralism, agriculture, and industrialism. Currently, we live in a world that is dominated by industrialism. However, there are quite a lot of people that still exist in the modern world that practice all other types of modes. It's just that in the United States, mostly we are industrial or even a post-industrial nation. So all of these modes of livelihood can also be directly related to their political organization. So if you remember cultural materialism, we had the subdivisions of band, tribe, chiefdom, or state. So you'll notice as we go through the following slides that I have written the type of livelihood, so foraging, plus its associated political organization. So for example, on this slide, it's foraging, and these groups are particularly prone to have band type organization. So foraging. On this map, you can see a bunch of orange areas that have different groups that are considered foragers in contemporary society. For our purposes, the San, which are in the sort of southern tip of Africa, are one of the foraging groups that we'll be studying. So foraging was the only subsistence pattern used by humans for about from about 200,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago. And primates, like apes and chimpanzees and macaques, still continue to forage. And we actually evolved out of that sort of primate behaviors into more human behaviors as we became Homo sapiens, and we kept on foraging because it was the mode of livelihood that we knew and we were comfortable with. So foraging includes both hunting animals and gathering plant materials. Fishing is actually included in the quote-unquote hunting of animals. Foraging groups are egalitarian, which is why they are considered a band-type organization. They use basic technologies, and they don't have a lot of complexity in the way that they function. Foraging groups also generally have very small numbers, between 25 and 40. And they generally like to keep their nuclear family close. So most bands are made up of a few nuclear families. Anthropologists have done quite a lot of research with foraging populations in Africa, and also a few anthropologists have studied foraging groups in the polar regions. And during the course of this, we found that foraging requires huge amounts of land. So people have to be able to move around a lot to survive. On this slide is a picture of the Agta people of the Philippines, and they are an active foraging group, just like the San peoples of South Africa. And we've also learned that through research that there's a pretty loose division of labor in terms of the gathering. Everyone participates in gathering. However, usually only the men hunt. No one owns property in a foraging society. They have a concept called use rights. And use rights means if you get there first, you get to use that land. If someone else arrives while you're there, then they have to ask your permission. And because they move so much, you only have use rights for short amounts of time. Foraging societies are very sustainable. Their needs are met with minimal work. And it's been shown that they only spend about 10 to 15 hours per week per adult foraging for food. Other than the San and the Agta peoples, we also know that band groups currently live or have lived in Madagascar. A lot of Aboriginal groups were bands. Some of them have transitioned into tribal type organization. But foragers still exist. They're just far fewer than they ever used to be. Moving into horticulture. A horticulture group is a group that's organized as a tribe or a chiefdom, which means that they have a bit more social complexity. They use slightly more complex tools than foraging or band groups. Horticulture emerged at about 12,000 years ago when humans first started to domesticate certain plants. And these plants included barley, wheat, corn, and potatoes. This happened in the Syria-Palestine region of Western Asia, and actually when we get to agriculture, I'll show you a map of that. Horticulture is basically basic farming. It involves the use of basic tools, and there's no manipulation through like gas-powered engines and things like that. Most horticulture groups live in areas where they have to use a form of changing the environment called slash and burn, or SWID in agriculture. And basically this is cutting down everything, all the plant material, burning it, and then tilling all the burned soil into the rest of the soil. And this is all done with basic tools, like shown in the previous slide. They would use hand hoes, hand axes, things like that. In horticulture groups, they try to keep their population numbers low, less than a couple hundred, because you need a lot of space to grow products. And especially if you're doing SWIDing, you have to be able to move around so that the soil has time to sort of redeem itself and get its resources back. In horticulture groups, surplus is not necessarily encouraged because surplus can cause conflict between tribal members. A tribal group actually is related often mostly by kinship and mutual agreement. And their marriage patterns often require them to marry within their own tribe. And this often means that they could advance into a chiefdom type society, which would have a very clear hierarchy. In a tribal society, they're not going to have a very clear hierarchy. Within a horticulture group, they have a pretty clear differentiation of labor. Men clear the fields, but both men and women plant and tend the plants. Sometimes certain foods are reserved for men and other foods are reserved for women. For example, any narcotic any narcotic substance is generally done and cared for, planted, everything is done by the men, mostly to sort of discourage the women from wanting to participate in narcotics because, you know, they are ultimately the ones that keep society growing because they bear children and raise children and things like that. Children are often in charge of some level of domestic work in a horticulture society, and that includes helping in the fields, but also in the home. They have a concept of use rights, just like foragers, but it tends to be more permanent. So if you own that, if you're using that land, that's your land, and someone shouldn't be allowed to come in and just take it from you. Sustainability for a horticulture group is okay as long as you have enough land. If you keep moving around and letting the soil recover, then you can survive in sort of wherever you're living, which is oftentimes the Amazon rainforest, for quite some time. For our purposes, we're going to be studying the Yanomami, and they live in Peru, in the Amazon, and we'll learn more about them in the coming weeks. Next, we have pastoralists, who are organized just like horticulturalists as tribes or chiefdoms, meaning they have temporary leadership or permanent leadership, depending on the level of complexity. This map here shows you where sort of well-known pastoral groups survive in the contemporary world. The Sami in Norway are actually really interesting, and you can find some YouTube videos about them, but we won't actually get to speak about them much in class. And as you can tell, pastoralists really only still are active in Central Asia and parts of Africa. And this is because modernity has sort of stopped the movement of pastoral groups. So a pastoral group is a group of people who herd domesticated animals. So camels, goats, sheep, cattle, water buffalo, things like that. And they use almost entirely secondary products for survival, which means that they don't necessarily butcher the cattle. They will sell them at market, but they'll make milk, cheese, yogurt, curds, things like that out of whatever that animal produces. People were herding animals basically since the Neolithic period. So again, for quite a long time. And a lot of groups have been using dogs for protection since they basically started herding animals. And this is because dogs are really a good way to keep predators away. So most pastoral groups will have a dog sort of traipsing around with them. There are two types of pastoralism. The first is pastoral nomadism, and this is where everyone in the group travels. Pastoralists, just like horticulturalists, try to keep their numbers about 100 so that it's not too many people, but enough so that there's enough production for everyone to survive. The other type is transhumance, and this is when only a select group of people travel around. Everyone else lives permanently in the settlement. These two different types require different organization and division of labor. If you're a pastoral nomadic troop or tribe, excuse me, you will have mostly the men herding the animals, and the women sort of helping raise the children, processing secondary products, helping set up camp, things like that. If you're involved in transhumance, again, the men are gone, but they're no longer involved at all in any of the home life. So most of the time during transhumance, the younger men will go and bring the sheep or goats around and then eventually bring them to be sold. In this case, then, the women and the older men and the children are really in charge of everything else at the home site. And that also means that they have to have enough access to resources to survive without using the entire, the usual amounts of secondary products. So a lot of transhumance pastoralists will sort of get visits from the herders, and they'll bring back products and things like that. Within pastoral groups, they don't think about land as something to own, only their animals. So most pastoral groups will talk about the inheritance of animals to their sons or daughters, and they won't even think about the land that they're on as part of their ownership. They're just using it or passing through it. And in this case, that means that in the contemporary world, where we have all these nice borders, for example, Africa and Europe here on this map, we see that, you know, they are really restricted. So because they don't think about land ownership, they instead have to think about their animals. And if they don't think about land, then they don't realize that they're crossing into places they're not allowed. Okay, I'm going to cut off here and resume in another video.